The man who read the will was not a lawyer, just the county administrator, a man whose face seemed permanently puckered from a diet of dust and disappointment. Ilara stood before his desk, her hands clasped behind her back, a posture her father had taught her for remaining calm in the face of authority. She did not look at her brothers, Cole and Mason, who flanked her like a pair of grim, broad-shouldered bookends. She focused instead on a water stain on the ceiling, mapping its geography in her mind, tracing its faint, brown coastlines. "It's straightforward," the administrator said, shuffling papers that smelled of stale pipe smoke. "The deed to the Rocking K Ranch, encompassing all structures and contiguous parcels, passes in equal share to the surviving sons, Cole and Mason Kane." He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "A contract of sale has already been executed with the AgriWest Corporation. The proceeds, after settling outstanding debts, have been divided accordingly." He slid 2 thick envelopes across the scarred wooden desk toward her brothers. They took them without a word. Cole's knuckles were white. Mason's jaw was a knot of granite. They had gotten what they wanted. The land, the house her father had built, the legacy they measured in acreage and head of cattle. Then the administrator pushed a 3rd envelope toward her. It was thin, almost pathetic. "To his daughter, Ilara Kane, my father bequeaths the sum of $300, being her final portion of the estate, and his sincerest wish for her future endeavors." The words were not her father's. They were the cold, sterile language of legal dismissal, translated by her brother's ambition. $300, an insult wrapped in boilerplate sentiment. It was the price of her childhood, the cost of her eviction. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply took the envelope, the paper flimsy and unsubstantial in her grasp. Her father had not taught her how to manage a ranch. He had tried, but her brothers, older and stronger, had shouldered her out of that world with casual disdain. They saw her as a creature of whimsy, always wandering off with her father not to check fences, but to study the flow of a creek or the strata of a rock face. Her father, a surveyor by trade before he was a rancher by inheritance, had seen the world differently. He saw it not as a surface to be owned, but as a complex machine of stone, water, and time. And that was the world he had shown her. He had taught her the language of the land, how to read the lean of a juniper tree to find the prevailing wind, how to identify the deep green of water, loving cottonwoods in a dry wash, how to feel the subtle coolness of the earth that hinted at moisture far below. He taught her carpentry, the satisfying logic of a dovetail joint, the heft and balance of a good hammer. He taught her masonry, how to mix mortar that would last a century, how to read the grain of a stone to know where it would split clean. He had been a man of quiet competence, and he had worked to make her the same. The day before he died, he had pressed his most prized possession into her hand. It was a plumb bob, but it was unlike any other. It was heavy, made of solid brass, and warm from his grip. Its surface was not smooth, but covered in a filigree of impossibly fine engravings, contour lines, hydrological symbols, the spiral of a nautilus shell. It was a tool for finding true vertical, but in his hands it had been something more, a dowsing rod of science and instinct. "Gravity never lies, Ilara," he had told her, his voice thin as autumn smoke. "And it's always connected to the water. Remember that." Now that plumb bob was the only thing of substance she owned, tucked away in a leather pouch in her pocket. It felt heavier than the $300. "You have until Friday," Cole said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was Monday. "The AgriWest people are doing their final walkthrough then. They want the property vacant." Ilara nodded once, her gaze still fixed on the ceiling. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The house was no longer hers. The land was no longer hers. Her father was gone. There was nothing left to break for. She turned and walked out of the administrator's office, the thin envelope a cold spot against her palm. She did not look back. She spent the next 2 days in a state of methodical calm. She did not pack memories or mementos. Her brothers and their wives were already boxing up the life she had known, their movements efficient and unsentimental. Instead, Alara packed for a journey. Into a sturdy canvas satchel, she placed her essentials: a small, sharp hatchet, a whetstone, a coil of good rope, a tin of matches sealed in wax, a change of sturdy work clothes, a leather-bound journal, its pages still mostly empty, and, in its own protected pouch, her father's brass plumb bob. She zipped the paltry $300 into an inside pocket. On Wednesday morning, before the sun had breached the jagged peaks to the east, she walked out of the house for the last time. She did not go toward the main road, toward the town where pitying glances would follow her like shadows. She went east, toward the Badlands. Her father had always spoken of that territory with a strange mix of caution and reverence. He called it the Great Thirst, a place the world had forgotten, where the sun had baked all forgiveness from the soil. A place, he'd once said with a wry smile, where a person who understood water could be a king. For 5 days, she walked. The journey was a crucible. The sun was a hammer, the wind a blast furnace. She moved from one meager shade to the next, conserving her energy, her water, her will. She ate sparingly from the wild things she knew, the protein-rich bodies of roasted grasshoppers, the tart, fleshy pads of prickly pear cactus, carefully stripped of their spines. She found water where no one else would think to look, a weeping crack in a shaded canyon wall, a hollow in a stone that had collected the last rain, a patch of deep-rooted green that told her where to dig. Each sip was a sacrament. Each mile was a confirmation of the skills her father had given her. They were not hobbies. They were survival. On the 6th day, she limped into a town that was little more than a ghost of itself. It was called Terminus. A few weathered buildings leaned against each other for support, their windows boarded up or staring out like vacant eyes. The only sign of life was a squat, stone building with a crooked sign that read, Alvord County Clerk. Drawn by the promise of shade and cool stone, she pushed open the heavy door. The air inside was thick with the smell of dry paper and decay. A single man with a green visor sat behind a high counter, his face as weathered as the town outside. He looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and indifference. As she stood there, catching her breath, 2 men in dusty ranch clothes came in. They slapped a paper on the counter and laughed. "Still got the old station on the books, Abe?" one of them asked, a wide, cruel grin on his face. The clerk, Abe, sighed. "Always. Can't give it away." "Some poor fool will buy it someday," the second man chuckled, "thinking he'll find that lost spring. Place is nothing but a pile of sun-baked rocks and snake dens. Cursed is what it is." "What station?" Alara's voice was hoarse, cracking from disuse. The men turned, their laughter dying as they took in her ragged appearance. The clerk looked at her with a flicker of something that might have been pity. "The old Sunken Spring Station," he said, "out in the salt flats. Was a way station 100 years ago, built on a freshwater spring. Legend says the spring dried up overnight. The builder vanished. Been abandoned ever since." "How much?" she asked, her heart giving a strange, slow thump. The first man snorted. "It ain't for sale, missy. It's for forfeit. Back taxes. No one's been dumb enough to pay them in 50 years. "How much?" she repeated, looking directly at the clerk. Abe licked his thumb and flipped through a massive, crumbling ledger. He ran a finger down a column. $287, he said, then looked up at her over the rim of his spectacles. "And 50 cents. But I'm telling you, it's throwing money into a fire. There's nothing out there. Nothing but heat and rattlesnakes." Alara reached into her satchel. She pulled out the envelope. She counted out the bills, placing 2 $100 notes, 4 20s, and a 10 on the counter. She rummaged in her pocket and found a silver dollar. "Keep the change," she said. The two ranchers stared, their mouths agape. The clerk looked from the money to her face, a slow smile of disbelief spreading across his own. It was the expression of a man witnessing a joke he would tell for years. He took the money, his fingers lingering on it, as if to confirm it was real. He pulled out a long, yellow deed, dipped a pen in an inkwell, and began to fill it out. "Name?" he asked, without looking up. "Elara Kane." He scratched the pen across the paper, the sound loud in the silent room. He blew on the ink, then took up a heavy embosser and stamped it with a deafening crack. He slid the deed across the counter. "It's yours," he said, the smirk never leaving his face. "All 20 acres of sun-scorched hell. Good luck to you, Elara Kane." She took the deed, folded it, and placed it in her satchel. She bought a new canteen and filled it from the clerk's spigot, the water tasting of rust and chemicals. With the last of her money, she bought a sack of flour and a slab of salt pork from a general store, run by a woman who looked at her with deep, sorrowful eyes. Then she walked back out into the sun, the deed to a worthless pile of rocks in her bag, and headed for the salt flats. It took another 2 days of walking to reach it. The landscape grew progressively more hostile, the earth bleaching to a pale, cracked alkali. And then she saw it. It was worse than she had imagined, worse than the rancher's mocking description. The Sunken Spring Station was not a building. It was a scar, a jumble of collapsed stone walls and charred, skeletal timbers half swallowed by drifting sand. The roof was gone, the interior a chaotic mess of rubble and desiccated weeds. It looked as though a giant had stomped on it and then set it on fire. A wave of profound despair washed over her, so potent it made her knees weak. She sank to the ground, the brutal sun beating down on her. The clerk's mocking smile filled her vision. The rancher's laughter echoed in the vast, silent emptiness. They were right. She was a fool. She had traded her last pittance for a tombstone in the middle of nowhere. For a long time, she just sat there, the weight of her solitude pressing in on her. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, a sliver of her father's pragmatism cut through the despair. Crying wouldn't build a roof. Self-pity wouldn't find water. She got to her feet, her joints aching, and began to work. She needed shelter. She circled the ruin, her eyes scanning not for what was lost, but for what remained. On the north side, tucked against a low bluff that offered some protection from the wind, she found it. A small, rectangular section of the building was partially intact. 3 walls, built of massive, well-fitted stones, still stood, though they were choked with rubble. It might have been a pantry or a root cellar. The roof was gone, but the walls were sound. It was enough. For the rest of the evening, and by the light of a sliver of moon, she worked with a feverish energy. She cleared the rubble from the small, 3-walled space, hauling out rocks and splintered beams until her hands were raw. She used her hatchet to cut brush and pile it against the open side, creating a crude but effective windbreak. By the time she was done, she had a small, defensible space, open to the stars but shielded from the elements. Exhausted, she rolled herself in her blanket on the dusty stone floor and fell into a dreamless sleep. The next morning, she turned her attention to the heart of the station's name, the spring. It was a circular depression in the center of the ruined courtyard, about 20 feet across. The ground was baked, cracked clay, as hard as pavement. There was no sign that water had ever been there. It was just a dry, pathetic basin. She walked its perimeter, her boots crunching on the parched earth. This was the source of the station's life and its death. Driven by a flicker of curiosity, a refusal to accept total defeat, she began to clear the debris from the basin. It was slow, hot work. She used a broken piece of timber as a lever to move larger stones, and her bare hands to scoop away sand and gravel. As the sun climbed to its zenith, she was slick with sweat, her back screaming in protest. She was about to give up when her foot sank. It was not a dramatic plunge, just a slight give, a subtle shift in the ground beneath her boot. She stopped, frozen. She pressed down again. The ground was firm, but it felt different, hollow. She dropped to her knees and began to dig with her hands, tearing at the baked clay. A few inches down, her fingers struck something flat and unyielding. Not rock. It was too smooth. She scrabbled at the dirt, her heart beginning to pound. She uncovered a surface of dark, dressed stone, perfectly flat. It was a massive capstone, a single enormous slab that seemed to form the entire bottom of the basin. And as she cleared more of it, she saw something that made the air catch in her throat. Near the center was a small, square hole, no bigger than her thumb, filled with the orange dust of ancient rust. It was a keyhole, but for a key of a shape she had never seen. She sat back on her heels, staring at it. A keyhole in the bottom of a dry spring. It made no sense. Then she laid her palm flat on the stone. Despite the hours of relentless sun, the stone was not hot. It was cool, subtly, deeply cool. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Gravity never lies, Alara, and it's always connected to the water. Water has immense thermal mass. It holds the cold. A vast quantity of underground water would act as a heat sink, drawing the warmth out of the rock above it." Her hands trembled as she reached into her satchel and pulled out the leather pouch. The brass plumb bob felt heavy and real in her hand. She looked at the square hole, then at the tool. The pointed tip was for finding vertical, a simple, elegant function. But the top, the part where the string was attached, was different. It was not rounded or ornate. It was a square, precisely machined shank of solid brass, designed to be gripped or perhaps fitted into something. She knelt, her shadow falling over the strange keyhole. First, she tried the pointed end, but it just rattled loosely in the opening. Of course, it was a fool's hope. Then she stopped, her breath held tight in her chest. She turned the plumb bob over. She fitted the square shank at the top into the square hole in the stone. It was a perfect fit, as if one had been made for the other. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was no coincidence. This was a message, a puzzle left by a mind like her father's, a mind that thought in terms of physics and secrets. Using a heavy rock as a crude mallet, she gently tapped the base of the hanging plumb bob. It seated itself firmly in the socket. Taking a deep breath, she gripped the body of the tool and turned. For a moment, nothing happened. The resistance was absolute. She put all her weight into it, her muscles straining. Then, with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, something gave way. It was the sound of stone grinding on stone, of a mechanism unused for a century. The great capstone did not lift. It began to slide sideways. Slowly, ponderously, a black opening was revealed. A wave of air washed over her, cool and damp, carrying the scent of deep earth, wet stone, and something else, the clean, electric smell of ozone. It was the smell of living water. She peered into the darkness. A set of steep stone steps led down into the black. Her hands shook so badly she could barely function. She tore a strip from her blanket, wrapped it around the end of a piece of timber, and lit it with one of her precious matches. The makeshift torch flared to life, casting flickering shadows across the ruin. Holding it aloft, she descended the stairs. 10 steps down, 20, 30. The air grew cooler, the sound of her own breathing loud in the confined space. The steps ended in a small, vaulted chamber, no bigger than the room she had cleared for shelter above. The walls were not rough-hewn, but made of perfectly fitted, sweating stone. The air was cold and still. In the center of the chamber stood a heavy sea chest, bound with thick straps of iron, green with verdigris. Leaning against the wall beside it was a surveyor's transit on its tripod, its brass components gleaming in the torchlight as if they had been polished yesterday, and next to that, a worn leather satchel. She approached the chest, her torch held high. The lock was a massive, rusted hulk. She wedged the end of her hatchet into the seam and threw her weight against it. The old wood splintered and groaned, and with a final, screeching crack, the lid gave way. She lifted it. The torchlight glinted on a sea of gold. The chest was filled to the brim with coins. Not dollars, but double eagles, Stellas, Liberty heads. A fortune beyond comprehension, preserved in the cool, dry dark. But it was not the gold that held her attention. Lying on top of the coins, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. She set the torch in a wall sconce she hadn't noticed before and lifted the ledger out. Her fingers trembled as she untied the oilcloth. The leather was supple, the pages crisp. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was a precise, elegant script, the ink still a deep, rich black. My name is Elias Thorne. I was a hydrologist and engineer. If you are reading this, you are either a thief of uncommon perception or a soul of similar spirit to my own. I am betting on the latter, for the lock to this place was not one of brass and steel, but of observation and intellect. Elara sank to the floor, her legs no longer able to support her. She began to read. Elias Thorne's story unfolded across the pages, a narrative of brilliance and betrayal. He had been the one to discover the aquifer, a vast, deep river flowing through the rock far beneath the salt flats. It was not a simple spring, but a massive artesian wellspring under immense pressure. He knew it was the key to making the desert bloom. He had taken on a partner, a man with money and political connections, to fund the station, but the partner had betrayed him. While Thorne was engineering the deep-bore wellhead, the partner filed false claims, declared the spring dry, and used his influence to ruin Thorne's reputation. He left Thorne for dead, stranded at his own failed station. But Thorne had not failed. He had completed his work in secret. He had engineered a brilliant valve system, capping the artesian wellhead to conserve its pressure, hiding it all beneath the massive stone slab he'd quarried and moved into place himself. The dry basin above was a deliberate deception. He had lived out his days there, a ghost in his own life, sustained by his secret water and planning his quiet revenge. The ledger was filled with his work, geological maps of breathtaking detail, architectural plans for the station, essays on water pressure and stone cutting. The final entry was dated 50 years after the first. I am an old man now. The world believes me long dead. My betrayer is dead, his fortune squandered by his foolish heirs. My revenge is this: the water remains. It is pure and it is abundant. I have no heir of my own blood. Therefore I leave this place, this water, and this gold to the one who finds it, to one who has the wit to find the key, and the heart to make the desert bloom as I once dreamed. The true treasure is not the gold. The gold is merely the means. The treasure is the water. Use it well. Build. Create. Do not let the desert win. Elara closed the ledger, tears finally blurring her vision. They were not tears of grief or despair, but of profound, aching gratitude. She was not alone here. The ghost of Elias Thorne, a man she had never met, had just become her greatest benefactor, a spiritual mentor reaching across a century of solitude. She turned her attention to the leather satchel leaning against the wall. Inside, she found no personal effects, only a series of carefully preserved documents, tied with ribbon. They were official federal survey maps and, beneath them, a thick vellum document with a heavy wax seal. It was the original, federally filed water rights to the entire aquifer, registered in the name of Elias Thorne. By filing them with the federal government and not the local county, Thorne had bypassed the corruptible local politics and created an ironclad, unassailable claim that predated every other in the entire region. He had not just left her a fortune, he had left her an empire of water. A new strength flowed into Alara, a sense of purpose so powerful it felt like a physical force. She was not the inheritor of a ruin. She was the steward of a dream. She climbed back up the stone steps into the blinding light of day, no longer a refugee, but a founder. The work that followed was monumental, but it was not a chore. It was an act of creation, a conversation with the ghost of Elias Thorne. Using his transit, which she painstakingly cleaned and calibrated, and her father's plumb bob, she re-established the station's original lines with geometric precision. The gold was the means. She used a handful of coins to buy a sturdy mule and a wagon in a town 100 miles away, a place where no one knew her, or the story of the foolish girl who bought a ruin. She became a force of methodical labor. She cleared the rubble, not as a cleaner, but as an archaeologist, sorting the great, squared-off stones that could be reused from the shattered pieces that would become fill. She discovered Thorne's quarry, a half-mile away, where he had cut the original stones, and found his tools, rusted but serviceable, hidden in a cleft of rock. She taught herself to sharpen the old chisels, to swing the heavy stone hammers. The first task was to restore her own small room. She relaid the floor with flat stones, chinked the walls with fresh mortar mixed from local clay and sand, and built a roof of timber she hauled from a distant, stunted forest. Finishing it with slate tiles, she split herself. It was slow, back-breaking work. Each stone lifted, each beam set, was a victory. Then she turned to the water. Following Thorne's diagrams, she found the mechanism to uncap the spring. It was a series of immense iron levers, hidden in a side chamber off the main tunnel. It took all her strength, using a long timber for leverage, but finally, with a deep groan, the valve opened. For a moment, nothing. Then a low rumble from deep in the earth. Water, cool and impossibly clear, began to well up in the stone-lined basin in the courtyard. It rose steadily, silently, until it formed a perfect, placid pool that mirrored the vast blue sky. The sunken spring was no longer sunken. It had been resurrected. The appearance of a 20-foot-wide pool of fresh water in the middle of the salt flats was an event of near geological significance. It did not go unnoticed. The first to see it was a man named Silas, an old trapper who moved through the Badlands like a whisper. He appeared one evening at the edge of her camp, a tall, skeletal figure in buckskins, his face a road map of wrinkles. He did not speak, but simply stared at the pool of water, then at the half-rebuilt walls, then at her. "Elias Thorne's ghost is busy, I see," he said finally, his voice a dry rustle. He pointed a gnarled finger at the plumb bob, which she had hanging from a peg on her wall. "That was your father's, Jacob Kane. He had a good eye for the truth of the land." Alara was stunned into silence. Silas had known her father. He was not a threat, but a witness. He offered her no help, but he shared his knowledge, pointing out which of the local plants were good for medicine, and leaving a brace of rabbits at her doorstep a few days later. It was the first act of community she had known in this desolate place. The next to arrive was drawn by rumor. Jedediah, the blacksmith from Terminus, a man with arms as thick as fence posts and a beard stained with soot, rode out on a tired horse. He had heard the impossible story from Silas. He expected a trick, a mirage. Instead, he found Alara single-handedly wrestling a massive lintel stone into place above a new doorway, using a system of levers and counterweights that was both simple and brilliant. He said nothing for a long time, just watching her work, his eyes narrowed in professional assessment. "Your stonework is true," he said at last, his voice a gravelly rumble. He was not offering a compliment, he was stating a fact. "But your tools are poor." He looked at her worn hatchet, her makeshift hammer. "I can forge you proper chisels, a good set of hammers, pry bars. In exchange," he nodded toward the pool, "for water, and I'll have need of hinges and a gate for the west wall." It was not an offer of charity, but a contract between artisans, a trade of competence for competence. Alara agreed. Jedediah became a regular visitor, his wagon laden with the tools that made her work faster, more precise. In return, he filled his barrels with clean, fresh water, a commodity more valuable than gold in this parched land. He respected her, not for her gender or her age, but for the skill in her hands and the intelligence in her designs. The final piece of her new community was a woman named Maria. She ran a freight line with a team of 6 mules, hauling goods between the distant railroad and the scattered settlements. Her route made a long, 2-day detour to the south to reach the only reliable river. One afternoon, her led mule, smelling the water, veered off the barely there track and led the entire train straight to the Sunken Spring station. Maria, a stout, no-nonsense woman with kind eyes and a firm jaw, climbed down from her wagon seat, her face a mask of utter astonishment. She looked at the glistening pool, the rising walls, the small but thriving garden Alara had started. "Madre de Dios," she whispered. She looked at Alara, covered in stone dust and sweat. "You did this?" Alara simply nodded. Maria walked to the spring, cupped her hands, and drank. She closed her eyes. "This will change everything," she said. "My route. I can cut 2 days off my journey if I can water my team here. 2 days." She looked at Alara, a business proposal forming in her eyes. "I can bring you anything. Lumber from the mountains, glass for your windows, seeds, flour, whatever you need. In exchange, my team's water here, and I will pay you for a proper meal when I pass through." And so the community was formed, not by handshakes and pleasantries, but by the gravitational pull of a shared, practical need. Silas the trapper, Jedediah the blacksmith, Maria the freighter. They were solitary people, made so by the harshness of the land, but they recognized in Alara a competence and resilience that mirrored their own. They were the foundation of her new life. News of her success, carried by Maria's wagons and Jedediah's customers, spread like wildfire in the dry air. Whispers reached her of the AgriWest Corporation, the company that had bought her family's ranch. They were struggling. The long drought that had plagued the region for years was intensifying. Their wells were running low. They were spending millions drilling new ones, deeper and deeper, but they found only dust and bedrock. The great aquifer they were searching for, the one her father had suspected and Elias Thorne had proven, was entirely under her control. She never saw her brothers again, but she heard stories of their financial ruin, their arrogant certainty washed away by the relentless drought. There was no triumph in it, only a quiet, somber irony. They had grasped for the surface and lost the depths. Then the drought tightened its grip, becoming a crisis, a slow-motion catastrophe. The river to the south that Maria relied on dwindled to a muddy trickle. The wells in Terminus and the surrounding ranches went dry. Panic, a quiet and desperate thing, began to set in. Cattle grew thin, then died. People began to talk of leaving, of abandoning the land their families had worked for generations. But at the Sunken Spring station, the water flowed, cool and constant, indifferent to the baking sun above. It was a miracle, an island of life in a dying sea. Alara knew what she had to do. This was the test of Elias Thorne's legacy. It was not her water to hoard. With Jedediah and Maria, she organized a response. Maria spread the word along her routes. There was water at the station, free for any who needed it. Jedediah built a series of troughs and a simple but effective hand pump system to make collection easier. Silas taught people how to survive on less, how to find food in the parched landscape, and they came. At first, it was a trickle, a single family in a rickety wagon, their eyes wide with disbelief. Then more. They came on foot, on horseback, in old trucks that coughed and sputtered. They came not as beggars, but as pilgrims. Alara asked for nothing in return for the water. She opened her gates and let them drink, let them fill their barrels and their canteens. Her station became a sanctuary. The courtyard was filled with people, the air with quiet conversation. In the evenings, someone would play a guitar, the simple melodies a balm against the fear. The community she had built of 3 solitary people expanded to include dozens. They were bound together by the shared gift of water and the shared work of survival. During this time, Ilara took a portion of Thorn's gold and traveled to the state capital. With the help of a young, idealistic lawyer, she used Thorn's century-old, federally filed documents to have the water rights formally transferred to her name. Then she went a step further. She established a legal trust, placing the water rights into it in perpetuity. The terms of the trust, which she wrote herself with the lawyer's help, stipulated that the water was to be managed for the sustainable benefit of the local community, forever. She had fulfilled Thorn's charge. She was making the desert bloom, not just with plants, but with people. Years passed. The great drought eventually broke, but the world had changed. The Sunken Spring Station was no longer an isolated ruin, but the heart of a thriving, self-sufficient community. The main building was fully restored, its stone walls solid and true, its windows gleaming with real glass. The courtyard was shaded by young cottonwood trees, and the garden had expanded into a small, lush orchard. A few modest cabins, built by Jedediah and other newcomers, dotted the landscape nearby, their inhabitants the core of the new settlement of Thorn's Spring. One evening, Ilara sat on the porch of the main house, a cup of cool water in her hand. She was no longer the waif who had stumbled out of the desert, but a woman whose quiet confidence was as solid as the stone walls behind her. She watched the lights begin to twinkle in the windows of the nearby cabins. She heard the distant sound of Jedediah's hammer on his anvil, the laughter of children playing near the spring, the soft music of Maria's mules returning home. On the small wooden table beside her chair sat 2 objects. One was her father's brass plumb bob, its surface worn smooth from years of her own use, a constant reminder of the man who taught her to see the world's hidden structure. Next to it lay a small, perfectly smooth, dark gray stone she had taken from the floor of Elias Thorne's secret chamber on that first day. One was the inheritance of her blood, the other the inheritance of her spirit. They were the twin pillars of her life. She looked out at the small, resilient community she had anchored, a fortress of love and competence built in the heart of the great thirst. Her brothers had taken the house, the herds, the things they believed held value. They had left her with an insulting pittance and a set of skills they deemed useless. But her father had truly left her the knowledge of gravity and water, the most valuable inheritance of all. And a stranger, a ghost of a man betrayed, had left her the means to use that knowledge to build a world. The $300, the price of her banishment, had bought her everything. It was, she thought with a deep, quiet, and peaceful contentment, the best money she had ever spent.